You can't win an argument with a narcissist, not because you're not smart enough, not because you don't have the facts on your side, but because the argument was never actually about the facts to begin with. And once you understand that one sentence, everything about how you handle them is about to change. If you've ever walked away from a conversation with a narcissist feeling exhausted, confused, and somehow like you ended up apologizing for something you didn't even do, you're not alone, and you're not imagining it. Today, we're breaking down the single most effective way to deal with a narcissist, and it has almost nothing to do with being right. It has everything to do with understanding what's actually happening underneath the surface of every conversation you have with them. Let's start with why arguing with a narcissist never works, because until you really understand this, nothing else in this episode is going to land the way it should. When you argue with a normal person, there's a shared assumption underneath the disagreement that truth exists, that facts matter, that if you present enough evidence, the other person might actually update their position. That's how healthy conflict works. It's uncomfortable, but it's functional, because both people are playing the same game. Narcissists are not playing that game. For a narcissist, an argument isn't a search for truth. It's a contest for dominance. Being wrong isn't just an intellectual inconvenience for them, it's an existential threat, because their entire sense of self is built on a foundation of being superior, being right, being in control. So when you bring facts, evidence, logic, receipts, screenshots, whatever it is, you're not engaging their reasoning brain. You're triggering their threat response. And a person in threat response doesn't reconsider. They defend, they attack, they deflect, they rewrite history in real time, right in front of you, with a straight face. Because in that moment, psychological survival matters more to them than accuracy. This is why you can have a receipt, an actual screenshot, their own words, undeniable proof, and they will still, somehow, make you feel like the unreasonable one. It's not because the evidence doesn't matter. It's because evidence was never actually the terrain the fight was happening on. So if arguing doesn't work, what does? The method we're talking about today is often called gray rock, combined with something therapists call strategic detachment. But honestly, forget the clinical names for a second, because what actually matters is the underlying principle, and the principle is this. You stop feeding the part of them that needs a reaction, and you start responding in a way that gives them nothing to escalate against. Let's break this down into pieces you can actually use, starting today, in real conversations. The first piece is understanding what a narcissist is actually fishing for when they pick a fight. It's rarely about the dishwasher, or who said what at dinner, or whether you were 15 minutes late. Those are just entry points. What they're actually fishing for is your emotional reaction, your defensiveness, your hurt, your anger, your tears, your explanation, any of it. Because the moment you react, you've handed them exactly what they wanted, proof that they have power over your emotional state. That's the actual prize. Not being right, being able to move you. So the first skill, and it is a skill, one that takes real practice, is learning to notice the moment a conversation shifts from information sharing into fishing and choosing not to bite. This doesn't mean going cold or robotic. It means responding with calm, brief, emotionally neutral statements instead of the passionate, detailed defense every instinct in your body is screaming at you to give. Here's what that actually sounds like. Instead of launching into a 20-sentence explanation of why you weren't, in fact, ignoring them, why you had every right to make that decision, why their accusation is unfair, you say something like, "I see it differently," or "I hear you," or simply, "Okay, that's it." No elaboration, no justification. Because the second you start explaining yourself in detail, you've given them material. Every sentence you offer becomes something they can twist, reframe, or use to pivot the conversation somewhere new. Brevity isn't rudeness here, it's protection. The second piece is something I want you to really sit with, because it's counterintuitive. Stop trying to get them to understand your perspective. I know how hard this is. Every human being has a deep, legitimate need to be understood, especially by the people closest to them. But here's the hard truth. A narcissist's capacity for genuinely absorbing someone else's perspective, especially in the heat of a disagreement, is often severely limited. Not always completely absent, but functionally unavailable in conflict when their defenses are fully up. Spending your energy trying to make them get it is like trying to have a conversation with someone whose phone line keeps cutting out. You can talk louder. You can repeat yourself. You can get more detailed and more passionate, and none of it fixes the actual problem because the problem was never about volume or clarity. It's about capacity. Once you let go of needing them to understand, once that's no longer the goal, conversations with them become dramatically less draining because you stop measuring success by whether they finally get it. You start measuring success by whether you stayed calm, stayed clear, and got out of the interaction with your own peace intact. The third piece is what I call the broken record technique, and it's one of the most quietly powerful tools in this entire approach. When a narcissist tries to pull you off topic, and they will almost every single time, because derailing is one of their most reliable defense mechanisms, you don't follow them down the new path. You calmly return to your original point using nearly identical language each time. So if you said, "I need you to be on time for pickup," and they respond with, "Well, you're never on time either, and honestly, you're one to talk, remember last month?" You don't defend last month. You don't get pulled into a comparison of track records. You simply say, again, "I need you to be on time for pickup." Same words, same calm tone, as many times as it takes. This feels strange the first few times you do it, almost uncomfortably repetitive, and that's exactly the point, because you're not trying to win a debate anymore. You're refusing to participate in one. A person who is constantly generating new terrain to argue on needs you to keep following them onto new terrain for the fight to continue. When you simply don't follow, and you're not aggressive, not sarcastic, not triggered, just repetitive and calm, a lot of the fight simply runs out of oxygen. The fourth piece is about your face and your body, not just your words, and this is something people underestimate constantly. Narcissists are exceptionally skilled at reading micro-reactions, the flinch, the eye roll, the sharp inhale, the crossed arms, and they will use whatever they see as fuel. This doesn't mean suppressing your emotions in a way that's unhealthy for you long term. It means, specifically in the moments you're actively engaging with them, practicing what's sometimes called a neutral or gray rock presence, literally imagining yourself as boring and unreactive as a rock on the ground, flat tone, relaxed posture, minimal facial expression, not cold, not hostile, just unremarkable. Because an unremarkable, unreactive presence gives a narcissist nothing interesting to escalate against, and narcissists, more than almost anything, need things to be interesting, dramatic, and centered on them. The fifth piece, and this might be the hardest one, is knowing when to simply exit the conversation entirely without needing the last word. This flies in the face of everything most of us were taught about conflict, that you should stay, work it out, hash it through until there's resolution. With a narcissist, that instinct can actually trap you in an unwinnable loop because there is no natural stopping point for them. The conversation can continue for hours, circling the same territory, escalating instead of resolving, precisely because resolution was never the goal. Learning to say, calmly, "I'm not going to keep discussing this right now," and then actually leaving the room, ending the call, closing the laptop, that's not you losing. That's you recognizing the game for what it is and declining to keep playing past the point where anything productive can happen. I want to pause here and say something important, because I don't want this episode to leave you thinking that if you just execute these techniques perfectly, the narcissist in your life will suddenly become reasonable, or the relationship will suddenly become healthy. That's not what this is. These techniques won't change them. Nothing you do will change them, honestly, because change has to come from the inside, from a level of self-awareness and willingness to be uncomfortable that most narcissists, by the nature of the condition, simply don't access. What these techniques do instead is protect you. They preserve your energy. They stop you from bleeding hours of your life and pieces of your self-worth into conversations that were rigged from the start. And that reframe matters more than people realize because so many of us stay in these dynamics thinking if we just explain better, argue smarter, find the right words, the other person will finally understand and things will shift. These techniques are, in a strange way, a form of letting go of that hope. Not because hope is bad, but because that particular hope is what's been keeping you stuck in exhausting cycles that were never going to resolve the way you wanted them to. In part 2, we're going to go even further into this, specific scripts you can use in the exact moments this gets hardest, how to apply this with a narcissistic parent versus a partner versus a coworker, because the dynamics shift depending on the relationship, and what to do in the specific situation where gray rock doesn't fully work and you need an entirely different strategy instead. Stick around, because that part is where this really becomes something you can use in your actual life, starting today. Let's get specific, because knowing the theory is one thing, but knowing exactly what to say in the moment it actually matters is what changes your real life. Let's start with narcissistic parents, because this relationship carries a layer of complexity the others don't. History, obligation, and a lifetime of conditioning telling you that pushing back on a parent is somehow wrong, even when everything in you knows it's necessary. With a narcissistic parent, the fishing usually comes disguised as concern. I'm just worried about you. I'm only saying this because I love you. Why are you so sensitive lately? The script here isn't to argue about whether they're actually worried or actually concerned, because you'll never win that argument, and honestly, it doesn't matter. The script is to acknowledge without engaging. Something like, I hear that you're worried. I've got it handled. Said once, calmly, and then, this is the crucial part. You let the silence sit. Don't fill it. Don't over-explain. Most people's instinct is to keep talking into that silence because it feels uncomfortable. But that silence is actually doing the work for you. It signals that the topic is closed without you having to fight to close it. If your parent escalates, and with a narcissistic parent they often will, because the calm non-reaction itself can read as a threat to their control, the script becomes even shorter. I'm not discussing this further. Then you physically or conversationally exit, hang up, change the subject, leave the room. You are never obligated to stay in a conversation just because the other person hasn't finished trying to control it. Now, partners. This is different because with a partner, there's usually daily proximity, shared logistics, sometimes children, sometimes finances, which means full gray rock isn't always realistic or even healthy long-term, especially if you're planning to stay in the relationship or are navigating a slow, careful exit. With a narcissistic partner, the goal shifts slightly. Instead of full emotional flatness, you're aiming for what I'd call boring specificity. You stick to facts, timelines, and logistics, and you refuse to engage with character attacks embedded inside practical conversations. So if your partner says, "You're always so selfish, you never think about how your schedule affects me," this is exactly why nobody can rely on you. You don't respond to selfish. You don't respond to nobody can rely on you. You pull out the one factual thread and answer only that. I can pick up the kids at 5 on Thursday. That's it. You're not agreeing with the insult and you're not fighting it either. You're simply declining to acknowledge it as a legitimate part of the conversation, which, over time, radically reduces how often those insults get deployed because they stop being effective. With coworkers or a narcissistic boss, the calculus changes again, because here the priority isn't emotional safety exactly, it's documentation and self-protection within a professional structure that has its own rules. The scripts here lean heavily on email. If a narcissistic coworker or boss says something in person that misrepresents what you agreed to or subtly shifts blame onto you, you follow up in writing, not accusingly, just factually. Just confirming what we discussed. I'll have the draft to you by Friday, and the client asked for the pricing changes before we proceed. This does two things simultaneously. It creates a paper trail that protects you if they try to rewrite the story later, and it removes the emotional charge from the interaction entirely, because you're now communicating in a format where tone of voice, facial expression, and interruption, their favorite tools, simply don't work the same way. Now let's talk about what to do when gray rock doesn't work, because it doesn't always, and pretending it's a universal solution would be doing you a disservice. Gray rock tends to fail in two specific situations. The first is when the narcissist is genuinely dangerous, when there's a real risk of physical harm, severe financial retaliation, or targeted harassment. In those situations, gray rock isn't just insufficient, it can occasionally escalate risk because some narcissists respond to a loss of emotional control over you by reaching for more extreme forms of control instead. If this describes your situation, the priority shifts entirely away from communication technique and towards safety planning, documentation, legal protection, and, if needed, support from a domestic violence or workplace safety professional who specializes in exactly this. That's not something a podcast script can responsibly walk you through, and if any part of this resonates as your actual situation, please reach out to a professional who can help you build a real safety plan. The second situation where gray rock falls short is with a narcissist who has significant institutional power over you. A boss who controls your paycheck, a parent who controls your housing or finances while you're still dependent, a co-parent with joint custody. In these situations, full detachment isn't always possible, because you can't simply exit every interaction. Here, the strategy shifts toward what's sometimes called structured contact, minimizing unstructured, spontaneous interaction as much as possible, and moving as much communication as you can into written, scheduled, or third-party mediated formats. Co-parenting apps that log every message. Scheduled check-ins instead of open-ended availability. HR-documented conversations instead of hallway conversations. The goal is the same as gray rock: reduce their access to your spontaneous emotional reactions, but the method adapts to a relationship you can't fully step back from. I want to leave you with one more thing, because I think it might be the most important reframe in this entire two-part episode. All of these techniques, the gray rock, the broken record, the boring specificity, the calm exit, they can start to feel, especially at first, like you're the one being cold, like you're the one withholding, being difficult, refusing to communicate properly. I need you to release that guilt completely, because here's the truth. You are not obligated to give your full emotional self to someone who has repeatedly shown you they'll use it as ammunition. Detachment in this context isn't cruelty. It isn't giving up on the relationship out of spite. It's self-preservation, and self-preservation is not a character flaw. It's one of the healthiest instincts a human being has. And if you grew up being taught that your job was to keep explaining yourself until someone else finally understood you, unlearning that is going to feel foreign at first. That's okay. It's supposed to. If you're in the middle of this right now, if you read through these scripts and felt your chest tighten because you recognized exactly the conversation they describe, I want you to know you're not doing anything wrong by protecting your peace this way. You're doing something that took most people years of exhausting circular arguments to finally learn. Let me know in the comments which relationship this applies to most for you, parent, partner, or coworker, because I read every single one, and it genuinely shapes what we cover next. If this helped you see a way through a conversation you've been dreading, subscribe to Mind Horizon, because every week we break down exactly this kind of psychology. Not just what narcissists do, but exactly what you can do about it. I'll see you in the next one.